when I first started having friends in the US, like for instance, there's an example that I still remember to this day is I moved, that was in undergrad. So I was living with 6 other girls. They were all Americans. And I remember that one of my roommates told me, I don't know, not really arguing, they were talking about something. And she told me, look, Susan, I love you, but I'm not going to do that. And I remember just being very shocked because I barely knew her and she just told me she loved me. And that was very weird to me. And I didn't know if she actually meant it or if it's just a way of speaking. Because in France, if I say I'm your friend, if I say I love you, I really mean it. And so we wait a longer time to say that. And the meaning of the word, the value it has, the power it has is higher in France than it is in the US. And that was really kind of disturbing to me because I didn't know if she really liked me. It was kind of, or if it was just the way of speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my sense that would likely have been more of a way of speaking rather than a sense of actual, like, oh, you're this really, really close person to me. It probably almost would be translated to something like, look, I think you're cool. Like, you seem like a good person, but like, hey, I'm not going to do this thing. Which in
hindsight, now I know, but at the moment I was very disturbed. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. There's sort of this idea, not that I've studied a lot, but this concept of like high context culture and low context culture, where in a high context culture, everyone usually, they know there are a lot of these like unspoken social cues and concepts of like how you're supposed to behave. And everyone kind of knows what those things. In a low context culture, that sense is we assume nobody kind of knows anything. So we're just, we act in a very kind of different way. And the sense is that the US and arguably actually some other European countries, the stereotype is Germany as well, but like certain of those northern kind of Germanic countries are very like low context culture where people are just very like, we're just going to sort of act in a slightly different way than like high context cultures, which would be like France and Japan, I think Italy, Spain, where there's a lot more of like, we all are in on these set of values and ways of behaving that we all know to do when we're around each other, but outsiders don't necessarily know what that looks like. And they might make in our eyes a lot more in the way of like social faux pas, which seems to be sort of it would seem to me at least one difference. But my understanding is that the US is sort of very famously this very low context culture, partly because you have lots of these different people who've kind of all shown up. So there has to be sort of a very low bar for entry in terms of like what do people understand as like the basics of how people interact, and that also with some amount of self-selection bias there can be in this idea of like Americans are very they're very like strangely high energy. I understand is sort of like a stereotype that some people talk about where they're like, why are you so excited about this?
And it also goes into the way French people react when you tell them a story. And I've noticed that is when I talk to my American friends and I tell them a story, there's a lot of, oh my God, oh yeah, no, really. And when you tell a story to a French person, they're going to wait. They usually, there might be a smile or like a little nod or something, but there's not going to be this overly exciting expression or like sounds. We're just going to nod and smile. And then if it's really a big, huge, juicy story, we might react, but usually we're just nodding to make sure we are listening, but we're not going to comment everything. And so I remember listening to my American friends telling me a story, and them being like, "Are you listening?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'm listening. It's just I'm being quiet because I'm listening." And so it's funny. Those situations are funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other? I'm just curious if there's sort of other things like that, other of these sort of differences that you didn't know to expect, or maybe you kind of expected it, but still when it happened, you thought, oh, isn't that interesting? And it can also be like negative stuff too. Like we don't, we can play in a box here that's not just like everything's amazing. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, I think I was not expecting how important identity is to Americans. Especially knowing that it's such a young country, and has a very, complex and violent history, obviously. It feels to me that people are really very, not obsessed, but, it's very specific about their identity, which is very interesting to me because, for instance, I was born in Belgium. My mom's Belgian, my father was French, but I would never call myself Belgian French or French Belgian or. But here in US, obviously you have Asian Americans, you have African American, and then Latinos, and then so you have all those categories of identities and origins and where people come from, which we don't really label in France. We don't really identify ourselves this way. So obviously, if you're in France and you have an accent, people are gonna ask you where you're from, but they're never gonna like label you as much as I've heard people label themselves in the US, and I was not expecting that.
Yeah, well, and also with the US too, I mean, it's probably less true now, and it's certainly less true in California, but for a long time, and especially I think still in the Northeast, even amongst white Americans, you have the whole national identity element there, which is like, oh, I'm Italian American, I'm Jewish, I'm Irish American.
Exactly.
Like, and then the one I understand a lot of Europeans find funny is the Americans where they're like, I'm 1/4 German, I'm one half Italian, I'm one half Polish, like. And Europeans, right? Like Europeans will always laugh whenever you mention that for Americans.
Yeah,
that's actually very interesting because obviously with France and especially I think for a lot of European countries, I've thought certainly for even more than 100 years, like you've had different groups of people who live in France that weren't like sort of that kind of I guess like the French ethnic group. Because you have people from North Africa, you have people from Italy, you have people from Spain to a certain degree. But your sense is that so if you were, let's say, North Africa, let's say you're from Algeria or you're from Italy and you live in France, a lot of people obviously from those countries live in France. If you had an accent, like what would your sense be of like how would people kind of deal with you? And what would, I mean, I know there's also a range too, like your feeling of like how French are you? Because I get there's that's obviously a very muddled topic now too, especially.
Okay. So there's, I feel like there's 2 points to that question. The first one is racism in France is really different than it is in the US. It's there. It's, French people are racist. It's, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's very different. I feel like it's less. Yeah.
I mean, it really is. It's kind of in all places
unfortunately,
of the world.
Unfortunately, it is. It's less in your face in France. It's more subtle, unfortunately. So it means that sometimes you might be a victim of racism and not even realize it because it's a little bit more subtle. And especially because, we don't have as much police brutality as you might have and things like that. And the guns are not legal here except if you're a hunter and things like that. So we have less events of blunt, just pure racism, though we still have them, obviously. And so all this to say, in terms of if you have an accent and how you look like, it depends where you're from. If you speak French with an Italian accent or a Spanish accent or even a German or an English accent, people are going to think it's cute. It's cute. You're like foreign. There's something exotic.
I'm trying to think of sort of equivalents in the US. But I don't know, the US is in some ways it's a very particular country. I mean, I've been trying to sort of learn a bit more about European elements of that and this dynamic because obviously it's become more of a interesting topic where you are starting to get sort of different groups of people that are in different parts of Europe. And like how does that affect sort of the general social social structure of the countries?
Racism in France, so as I said, I feel like it's less in your face and it's directed a lot to religion. Actually, people are very racist towards Muslims in France, and if you look Arab or if you look like you're from the Middle East, people are going to be more racist towards you. It's a complicated story too because when you take Algeria used to be a territory of France. It was invaded at some point by the French government, so it was part of France, but it was treated as less of other region. It was treated differently. Then there was a war, and then there's a civil war also, and so a lot of people moved from Algeria moved to France and were treated very poorly by the government. They were put in those like high buildings. It was kind of like, yes, we welcome you, but we're gonna put all of you in those buildings, and then we don't want you to mingle with us. That's created tension between people from Northern Africa and people who, white French people, I would say. Yeah.